Volume 4 C28. Demiurge responded to the question in a way Ainz never expected. Shaking. Shaking like a frightened and wounded child. "My father," he said, in contrast to the shaking of his body, right down to the tip of his lashing tail, the archdevil spoke with a quiet confidence. About this, he had no doubts. "My father," he said again, a little bit louder than before. "Lord Albert was my father." A part of Ainz was surprised. Demiurge having a familial sentiment? And yet it also made perfect sense as he came to understand what the archdevil said. Ainz reached out to Demiurge. "Tell him now," part of himself said, one hand out, like a lifeline, but rather than take the demon's hand, he curled his fingers to invite the archdevil to step closer. Ainz opened his mouth behind the mask, ready to speak, but he couldn't. At least, he could not say that. "Demiurge," he said, and when the demon stepped closer, Ainz asked him, "What do you remember of Albert?" A shaky smile took over Demiurge's face. "My lord, may I speak freely?" Ainz gave a nod while suppressing his anxiety at the question. "When I was an office worker, that never ended well for the one who asked it. I have spoken with all the guardians many times. We have a habit now, a routine of meeting to talk together as friends and colleagues. The topic of the supreme beings often comes up, and I know one thing for sure. Nobody, not even Albedo, remembers more than I. Their memories are fragmentary, intermittent. Mine are complete, or so I believe they are," Demiurge said. His eyes could not change expression, but the luster of them seemed to brighten. "I remember the hour of my making, when I opened my eyes for the first time, when Lord Albert touched my face and showed me to the rest of you," Demiurge said and brought a hand up to his right cheek. "He asked you all what you thought, and you all teased him a little, asking why he didn't make a cute girl like Mare. I didn't know at the time why they laughed. But I remember Lord Albert saying I was perfect the way I was." Demiurge's throat formed a lump. "I was so proud of myself. I remember when the invasion happened, I fought as hard as I could against the invasion, protecting my master's home until the supreme beings could gather, and Lord Albert had me healed first. It was my proudest moment, and I learned all too well that everything beyond the tomb is a danger that must be crushed or it will crush my home. And I remember when I began to see him less." He spoke of the chance to attend university. "Of course, my master, my maker, my father, would create a universe to oversee. And the waiting grew longer and longer, and I began to see him less and less and less." Demiurge was incapable of tears, but the way his tail stiffened and drooped by turns spoke volumes. "I held out, thinking he would take me with him, wondering why he hadn't called on me to help. Was I not made for that purpose? But what son can truly know their father's mind? And of course, then came the last day. The last time I saw my lord, he handed you his weapons, all his things, and disappeared. He looked at me once, up and down like the day my eyes first saw him. But unlike then, he said nothing. Then he said goodbye to you, and was gone." His head dipped. "My father walked away from me without a word. He did not take me with him. He must not have wanted me with him. How I failed, I never knew." Ainz moved without thinking. His hand darted out and snatched that of Demiurge as soon as it dropped away from the cheek where it lingered for too long. "No," Ainz interjected. He vigorously shook his head. "Your father didn't leave you because of that, he left you behind because you couldn't have gone where he was going." There Ainz paused. He ran through ways to say what he wanted to. "There was no way for you to survive there." Ainz engulfed the hand of the archdevil with both of his own. Looking up from behind the mask, he began to see Demiurge in a very different light. "All of us loved Nazarick. But the other realm, the place we were in when not in the tomb, it made many demands of us all. Even the hands of supreme beings can be forced by necessity." Demiurge could not meet the eyes of the Lord whose eyes sought his. Ainz spoke in a hushed but firm whisper, as he would to reassure a small boy uncertain of his father's love after a punishment. "That is the truth, I swear it on my name." That is a relief, Lord Ainz. But that is a great deal even for me to take in. May I humbly ask some time to process all of that?" "Of course. Why don't you go on and explain? Ask what you have worked out about my plan. Tell me more," Ainz suggested, and the archdevil perked up immediately, though he did not try to withdraw his hand from the clasping of his lord. When it was over, Ainz pulled his own hands away and reached into his dimensional storage. From it he drew a little statue of a many-armed person bearing multiple pearl-sized gems. Its eyes were shut as if in death or sleep, and had a deep bronze shade to it. You mentioned the use of pop monsters, but this will serve you better. Albert made it. This is Armageddon evil, able to summon many demons not of Nazarick, and there is a perfect place to hide it as well. Ainz explained and placed the little statue into the archdevil's open hand. Demiurge looked down at the object and cradled it with folded fingers as if it were a child in his palm, or at least, like a child that was not meant to be an experiment or food. I am deeply, deeply honored, my lord, Demiurge said with a quiet whisper. Use it to benefit my kingdom. Ainz replied using noble command voice number 7. A special thanks to Queen Draudillan for that one. I will, my lord. Demiurge promised with a great wide smile on his face which bared his sharpest teeth against the dim light of the room, causing them to gleam like steel knives in the sun. Oh, and one more thing, Demiurge. Ainz added, recalling the absolute barbarism of the battle between the frogman and the lizardman. My lord? Demiurge asked. Chastise the Quagga. But keep it within reason. They will be my people too, even if their pride must be humbled. Massacre is a waste. Ainz put it in terms the archdevil would understand, and Demiurge nodded along. Right, so nothing wasteful. So he's saying that experiments are preferable by far. Demiurge's pride in his master rose. Nothing wasted, everything gained. Such wisdom is truly fit for the leader of the supreme beings. Demiurge thought and put the item away. Of course, my lord. Nothing will be wasted, he replied, and summoned the gate to disappear. No sooner had Demiurge vanished through the gate than a dreadful urgent pounding began on the door to Ainz's room and Gondo's voice rang out. My lord. My lord. It's urgent. Volume 4 C29. Ainz immediately called out, Enter. And Gondo Firebeard flung open the door with such urgency that it slammed against the wall and bounced back toward him. It missed his face only because the dwarf rushed past as quick as his little legs could carry him. My lord, the Quagga are here. Gondo half shrieked it in alarm. His eyes burned with fear, and from outside cries of alarm and confusion began while a great bell began to toll over the dwarven city. The ringing was long, slow, and steady, the deep noise rebounding off the black stone above, coming back down like the sky itself was falling and causing the dwarves to cry out in panic. Their pounding feet were heavy enough to fight back against the noise of the ringing bell above their heads. Even from within the stone walls of his room it was impossible not to hear the noise as the city fell into chaos. Even without seeing them, Ainz was immediately reminded of the village of Frogmen, when the lizardmen broke through, smashed the eggs, killed young and old, and would have wiped the entire population out root and branch had Hecate not surrendered when she did. All dying peoples are the same. Consumed above all things by fear of their annihilation. He thought, and rising up from where he sat, he approached Gondo Firebeard. Are your leaders asking for my help? No. Not exactly. The army is mobilized, but Gondo said. Then Ainz raised a hand to stop him. I will save the runesmiths who pledged themselves to me. But the Dwarven Council has not chosen to subordinate themselves to me, or even ally, or trade with me. It would be unnatural, don't you think, for me to commit myself, and also my nation to helping another that rejects me? Gondo was breathing very hard, but the smooth silken words of the king cut to his core. Yes. Yes, you are right. Of course, you're right. Ainz put a hand on Gondo's shoulder and looked down at the dwarf. Even with his loyalty sworn to Ainz, even with his craft rejected and essentially on the verge of being given away, the dwarf had friends here. Abandoning them would be very difficult. It isn't right, and it isn't fair. But when there are many kings, there are many loyalties. Two masters can't both be served well. Ainz consoled the dwarf as best he could, and the runesmith nodded as the weighty truth became part of his understanding of the wider world. He then raised his head, a bold move as he had not asked permission, and looking up at his new master he asked, But couldn't your majesty come to the gate? If nothing else you may learn more about the Quagga, and perhaps the council will ask for your help there if they feel the threat is great enough. A tad disingenuous, Gondo. Hoping to move me or embroil me in the fighting if it comes to it. But it may be as you say. Ainz replied. As expected of your majesty, you see through my petty efforts. I beg your forgiveness, it's only that my friends. They're weak, by dwarven standards. If you're their only help, it's just common sense to try. He winced when Ainz squeezed the white-gloved hand on his shoulder, and a spark lit in the King of Nazarick. An echo of Touch Me's spirit seemed to glow from the dwarf as the words mirrored those of the vanished guild member. Very well, bring Hedgenmill to me immediately and I will go to the gate. Ainz promised. At once, my lord. Gondo's face lit up bright as day and he rushed out of Ainz's quarters as fast as he could. Minutes later Ainz was on Hedgenmill's back and the dragon was trotting through the street toward the gate. The bell still rang but the din of the dwarves had begun to die down. The wall, Ainz could see, was lined with dwarves in seemingly very well-made armor. The metal gleamed in the glowstone's light and for the moment, it could even have been said to be majestic. Majestic, except for the very obvious fear. The dwarves held their crossbows, but they held them unsteadily, fingers twitched and feet shuffled, armor rattled where they shook as they waited for the battle ahead. The streets were all but empty, though other dwarves stood on rooftops, some with rocks, others with swords, hammers, spears, and many without proper armor. Ainz rocked back and forth atop the rolling shoulders of the dragon, his hands steadily held just beyond the base of the neck. Alone in the street except for Gondo who jogged ahead, he felt the hopeful eyes of the dwarves who grasped for anything that promised some hope of salvation. Will this be the day we die? Or the day we are delivered? Before Ainz reached the gate, the shouting atop the wall became full of confusion. For a moment a sweeping cry carried its way back like a crowd picking up from a lone voice, but when the obvious confusion hit, the noise stopped. Ainz reached the gate just as the commander descended from the small tower. Commander, what is it? Ainz asked, looking down from atop the dragon as he did. It was easy to see the effect on the dwarf. The commander looked around, past Ainz, nearly frantic, searching for someone to pass the decision on to, and finding no support. His shoulders slumped. Mighty lord, the ones approaching are Quagga, but they are coming with dwarves. They are fleeing together. We thought at first it was some of our own running from Quagga pursuers but... Now? He shook his head. No, they are very clearly one body, no killing, no fighting. I don't understand. The dwarven warrior looked up. I don't know what to do here. It could be a trick. I don't think so, but if it is, we can't let our people out there be slaughtered before our walls. He leaned forward and whispered so that no other would hear. That would be like confessing there is no hope left. Ainz reached up and stroked his chin in thought. Yes. Well. Your kingdom was kind enough to put me up for the night and hear me out despite coming unannounced. Perhaps I could repay the favor. I doubt very much the Quagga would attack a stranger, at least not without knowing whom they're fighting. I will venture out. If it is a trap, if they were to attack, then we have a common enemy. If they don't? Ainz shrugged it off. We'll see what's driving them to run toward your way. Ainz didn't wait for the dwarf to answer. Instead he patted Hedgenmill's neck. Ascend, and let's go meet the Quagga. The wings of the overweight dragon sprang out far more majestically than one would have expected given his excess weight, but it was enough to drive anew from the dwarves who had never seen a dragon before, let alone one's great wide bat-like wings spread in all their glory. The icy blue contrasted with Ainz's white and gold, giving even Hedgenmill a moment of nobility as they flapped and lifted him into the air and above the wall. As Ainz went over the wall and toward the panicked mass heading toward the wall, the commander of the dwarven army followed the king with his eyes up and head tilted back to miss nothing. He etched the moment into his memory and said, I didn't expect that. To which Gondo answered by clapping the commander on his shoulder and saying with bright eyes and a bright smile, what else would you expect out of a true king? Volume 4 C30. Atop the dragon, Ainz could clearly see why the dwarves panicked as they did. From a distance, they must have looked like a great minion number, when in fact they were not nearly as numerous as all that. A small number of defenders, and a small number of attackers, and now all reduced to what amounted to nothing more than refugees. All right, set me down there, Hedgenmill, Ainz said and pointed to the ground ahead of the walls of the city. It was obvious when the fleeing figures saw him, they began to slow, seeing a dragon circling in a slow descent beneath the sky of stone until it touched the ground. The words of Punitomo came to mind, throw something odd and unaccountable in their path, and you may halt an entire army. Ainz landed and dismounted from the dragon. He kept his left palm resting on Hedgenmill's long neck and waited as the slowing numbers of dwarves and Quagga began to approach far more tentatively, but they did continue to approach. Come closer, I won't harm you. My name is Ainz Ulgaun. I am the king of the nation of Nazarick. Ainz called out, and holding up a hand, he curled it inwardly toward himself, indicating that they should collectively come closer. Being taller than any dwarf, and so obviously not one, he became a sort of neutral figure to both the dwarven and the Quagoan numbers. The scattered ranks continued their unofficial truce and approached on slow steps. Many of them were exhausted, carried as far as they were only by the raw terror that still touched their steps. There came a point, however, when even fear could not carry them farther on their flight. When they collectively stopped well out of reach of the dragon's breath, Ainz took one step forward, putting himself between them and the dragon. Send forward a representative then, one from each of you. The scattered numbers began to organize themselves with relative speed, considering most of them had to trudge. Mutterings and mumblings that were probably words, but which were too mangled by distance and softness of voice, ran rampant through both groups until one dwarf and one Quagoa shambled forward. Sit, Ainz said immediately when they came close enough, and they flopped hard onto their backsides with sighs of relief. Now, tell me what has happened? Are you friends again? I heard you were enemies. A Quagoa face did not reveal very much, but it appeared at least they had the same cockeyed look that most bipedal species seem to have when confused. With the representatives seated, Ainz towered even more over both races. Now, start at the beginning, Ainz said as gently as he could, but the Quagoa's sharp jaw opened and he answered with a slew of questions. Who are you? What are you? Why are you here? It went on, and though it was the dark-furred Quagoa who spoke, the dwarf clearly favored the questions, looking up with the same cockeyed face as his counterpart. I suppose it is only natural that you should ask that. Very well, I will begin, and then await your answers, Ainz said, and began his story. Including the fictional parts wherein his kingdom was quite ancient, he peppered the story with anecdotes about the Undermountain Empire he once knew there, a cosmopolitan place where dwarf and Quagoa shared space freely. Recalling Demiurge's fabrications, he built them into his narrative, finally pointing to the great rift that was formed in a great clash to defeat a terrible demon. When he got to his description of the evil Lord of Wrath, both the dwarf and the Quagoa gasped, sucking in their breath and trading looks of mutual understanding. I can't quite recall his name, however. Ainz touched his head as if it ached. We slept for so long. Some memories. They're bright as day and eternal as a glowstone. Others. He bent forward a little, so obscure. Hard to recall. His name. Jiljal. Yaldabaoth. The dwarf and the Quagoa said it at the same moment, and both groups cried out in fear at their backs when the name of the towering demon was spoken. Yes. Yes, that is the name. Ainz sharply nodded his head. He stopped then, and stared down at them both. But if nobody remembers the things I've said, how can you possibly know that name? That is the reason we ran. The Quagoan warrior said with a dread look up at the king. Ainz took a shocked step back. It can't be. Yaldabaoth has been sealed since the rift-making. You described what we all saw. And if even a Quagoa agrees with me, great king, you defeated this being once before, you say? The dwarf replied. Yes, Ainz replied, he was weakened enough by runecraft weaponry. And with the enchanted runecraft armor, the armies of both dwarf and Quagoa held out while I sealed his army into an object and then confined him in the same way. The last I saw of either, the object holding him prisoner was being locked away, and the object confining his army was tumbling into the rift. It was never found, but with him confined and both dwarf and Quagoa watching over the rift, it didn't matter. There were bigger concerns. If all of that is so, then how are you here now? The Quagoa asked, its claws digging into the stone beneath him, gouging it deeply. I was awakened, my ancient home was invaded. Now my kingdom is restored. I can't help but wonder if Yaldabaoth wasn't awakened precisely because we were? Ainz rubbed his chin in deep thought, and a low grumble of disgust reached both groups. Now, it is your turn. Ainz pointed at the Quagoa. Tell me everything you know, beginning with why the ancient union of your peoples was destroyed, if you know it, and all leading up to today. The Quagoa froze like a doe caught off guard by the sudden appearance of our hunter. The dark-furred creature was full of stammering and uncertainty, with little he could say about their history, but Pei-Euro figured large and got a glowing depiction in the present day when he got up to that point. And when it came down to the reason for conflict, the spokesman made it plain. We want to rule the mountains, that is all. The Quagoa desire to raise our place in the world. Dwarves are in the way, so we're getting rid of them. So, if I were to offer the Quagoa a mountain range of their own, something unencumbered by dragons or dwarves where they could grow to the limits of their potential? Ainz let the question hang, and at that the Quagoa snapped his jaw shut and looked at Ainz as if his head had become gold, and the Quagoa had become Midas himself. A mountain of our own? The Quagoa asked. Yes, Ainz replied. This part of the world has long ranges, and I'm sure I can provide you what you want. If you return to my service, and if your people aid me against Yaldabaoth. The Quagoa nearly shot to his feet. The temptation was great in his eyes, his whole body stiffened like the dead as he explained, I can't agree to that. I lead only a few hundred warriors. Only Pei-Re-Euro can. Will Pei-Re-Euro listen to you? Ainz demanded and stepped a hair closer to the Quagoa, the short being shrunk in fear. I don't know. My lord. The Quagoa whispered, even if he does, the dragons. Ainz cut him off again. If Yaldabaoth is back, and has met the dragons, then there are unlikely to be any dragons left to oppose Pei-Re-Euro's decision. He then snapped his pointed finger to the dwarf. There is another way across the Great Rift, isn't there? The dwarf reflexively nodded. Yes there is, my lord, he gasped out in haste. Escort the surviving Quagoa over it, send them back to their people, let them tell the truth of Yaldabaoth to theirs, as you tell the truth to yours. If Pei-Re-Euro is wise or alive, then all as it was will be again. Ainz proclaimed, and both looked overtly confused. Quagoa, tell your chief to bring all his people here. Yaldabaoth will be searching for his army of demons. If Pei-Re-Euro is as wise and canny as you say, he will do as I say. If he is dead, let his successor come. If he is a fool, then you will all die out buying time for the dwarves to prepare for the fight. Life, or death, the choice is his. Ainz lowered his pointed hand back to his side. He recalled a moment in which Queen Draudillan spoke in anger, how she snapped out her command of go to someone who was not moving fast enough from her presence. What are you waiting for? The Demon Emperor to catch up to you? Go, Ainz snapped, and the Quagoa shot to his feet. The dwarf chosen as a representative scrambled to his feet just as fast, and with great haste they scurried to carry out the command of the king. The rest of you, follow me into the city. You have to tell your people to get ready to resist a demon. There was not one, no matter how weary, who was slow to follow Ainz's command.